I suck at drifting. And according to my Twitter poll, so do you. But why? Is it just a mere skill issue, or is there more to it? Well, you clicked on the video and probably expect an answer by the end of it. So buckle up, subscribe, and let us find out. This all began the other day, while I was busy sucking at drifting. You know, the usual spinning out, hitting walls, and drifting into other people. But all of a sudden, it came to me. The reason why you suck at drifting. Although, what I just said is slightly incorrect. You see, as a failed engineer, sorry mum, the only thing I remember learning is how to approach problems. There isn't one major issue that's preventing you from being good at drifting, but rather there's a group of smaller problems that all together contribute to you doing this. But what are these smaller problems? And most importantly, how do you fix them? Well, there are 4 main types of issues you may have, and conveniently, they all start with the letter S. Skill, setup, game, and feel. I'm sorry. The last of which you can't fix. But don't worry, I'll explain later. Before going into detail, bear in mind that there is some opinion in the facts I'm about to spit. So more power to you if you disagree with me, and believe that the only thing stopping you from becoming the next Formula Drift champion is your severe constitution. And with this out of the way, let's start with skill. So as all things in life, drifting is a skill that requires practice and dedication to improve. And I'm not talking about a couple days or weeks. Unfortunately, you probably need tens, even hundreds of hours to get good at drifting. But this greatly depends on a number of different factors, which we'll cover shortly. But before that, how do you fix skill? Well, the first step to improve your drifting is admitting you can't fucking drift. But even if you already have some experience, remember that there is always room for improvement. Watching tutorials that go over the basics of drifting is really good, regardless if it's your first time drifting or if you've spent half your life doing it. I also suggest finding an hour or so in your day to dedicate to drifting. But be careful not to drift too much. As my gym bros already know, overdoing your workouts is actually counterproductive. The same applies to drifting sessions. That's why I recommend keeping it under 2 hours a day. And if you start spinning, then it's probably time to stop. But most importantly, keep it fun. The last thing you want is to get frustrated while doing something you like. Next up, there's all the issues related to your setup. These include the obvious, such as your input method, but also your game settings and even your car's tune. So let's begin with the obvious, input method. Now this mostly depends on what game you're drifting in, but generally speaking, your best option is a steering wheel. A controller is fine most of the time, especially for arcade games. Keyboard is pain, stay away from that. And finally, seek help if you're a mouse steering. I have no idea how people do this, honestly. Of course though, you'll also need to properly set up your input method. A well set up controller is easier to drift on than a poorly set up wheel. That being said, settings are usually pretty easy, unless you're me, who was using his overpriced direct drive steering wheel with controller settings. If you ever have doubts about your settings, just search for a tutorial on YouTube with this format. And after following said tutorial, adjust the settings to what best suits you. And finally, your car's tune. This too hugely depends on what game you're playing, and don't worry, we're going to be talking about games in just a second, but generally speaking, default tunes are good enough, so you shouldn't worry too much about that. If that isn't the case though, just search for a tutorial for your specific game and vehicle. But then again, also try to figure out things by yourself. Don't get stuck following tutorials and copying other people's settings. Don't get me wrong, learning from others is great, but you should use that knowledge to then do things by yourself. And with that out of the way, let's talk games. Since the beginning of this video, I've spoken with the assumption that you are somewhat familiar with the games where drifting makes sense. But who knows at this point, there's fucking toddlers on this website, so yeah. Let's get the basics out of the way first. Drifting makes sense in any open world or track-based racing game as long as they have the following: free driving, street or drift cars, and some form of tuning. Let's make a few real-world examples. F1 22. It has free driving, but it doesn't have street car. Need for Speed Most Wanted 2012. arguably the best racing game ever made. It has free driving, it has street cars, but unfortunately it doesn't have any tuning. And finally, Drift Legends, the worst rated drifting game on Steam. It has free driving, it has street and drift cars, and it also has tuning. Does this mean it's a good game for drifting? Yes. That was a joke, stay away from that shit. But now that I think about it, do leave a like if you want to see me try it. Anyways, let me now tell you why, in my opinion, the best games for drifting. Assetto Corsa, BeamNG, Gran Turismo, Forza Horizon, e Carix Drift Racing. Now before you make an uninformed purchase decision, let me explain. These are very different games in all aspects, but for drifting, what you should most care about are the handling physics. You see, all racing games fall on a spectrum of realism, and at the end of the day, it's down to your personal preference and the type of experience you want. Arcade games are easy to get into, easy to get good at, and fun from the beginning, while simulators are pretty painful at the start, but extremely rewarding once you get good. Personally, I tend to get bored of arcade games pretty quick, since there's little to no challenge, and that's why I lean more towards simulators, which also have the perk of somewhat translating skill to the real world. Now this is where some of you go absolutely nuts in the comments. Get ready for a hot take. Drifting in games is harder than drifting in real life. I know, extremely controversial take, especially when it comes from a stupid Italian man who has never actually drifted in real life, while also being shit at simulators. But don't listen to me, listen to the people who have actually done it. All across the internet, the general consensus is that drifting in simulators is harder than the real thing. But why is that? Well, that's because of feel. Oh yeah. What the f does that mean? It's actually pretty simple. In the real world, you have access to all of your senses, but in a simulator, you only have access to a few. This means that the synapses in your brain have much less information to understand what your car is doing, thus making it harder to initiate and sustain drifts. There's this amazing video where a sim drifter drives an actual Formula Drift car for the very first time, and the dude just kills it, simply because he has so much more to work with compared to what he's used to. But now the question is, how do you fix the lack of feel? Well, unfortunately, as I said in the beginning, you can't. Yes, you can get better spatial awareness with VR, and yes, direct drive wheels are pretty good at giving you a decent idea of what the car is doing, but unfortunately, you just can't simulate the G-forces, the vibrations, and the sounds you get from the real thing. And at the end of the day, that's what makes it so special. So just deal with it, get better, have fun, and when you eventually want to do the real thing, it'll be as easy as riding a bike. Except it can actually kill you. In conclusion, you should now have figured out why you suck at drifting. But if you haven't, don't worry. The new Need for Speed game has braked drift.